This year, the 27th of July marked the 230th anniversary of an event that still reverberates in history and remains known by a date from the long-extinct French revolutionary calendar, 9 Thermidor. On that day, a revolt in the nearly 2-year-old French National Convention toppled the radical Jacobin regime led by Maximilien Robespierre and ended the Reign of Terror. The term Thermidor has acquired a larger meaning. Merriam-Webster defines it as a moderate counter-revolutionary stage following an extremist stage of a revolution. For the left, it has remained a term of opprobrium. A 1996 essay by French philosopher Alain Badiou, a staunch proponent of revolutionary communism and an idol of the radical left, argues that the term Thermidorian denotes a worldview that corrupts and neutralizes the transformative potential of revolution. At least that's the argument one can glean from such jargon-riddled phrases as the concept of the subjectivity constituted through the termination of a political sequence. While Badiou used the term to attack the anti-communists of his time, Canadian writer Yate Hare has made Thermidorian reaction his go-to term for the centrist liberal pushback against the radical social justice movement, exemplified by Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and climate protests. On the 13th of June 2020, Hare tweeted, "I'm old enough to remember when a Thermidorian reaction would take many months to organize. Now the bourgeois can pull it off in a few weeks. Must have something to do with social media, chat rooms, etc." On the 1st of June 2022, he tweeted, "Remember when there was a very large movement to challenge unchecked police power, quickly followed by a Thermidorian reaction by elite pundits and political leaders of both parties to delegitimize the movement. That was wild." And on the 25th of June, he tweeted, "The current Thermidorian reaction we're witnessing, establishment backlash against trans rights, Me Too, BLM, echoes a forgotten moment in history, the widespread elite freakout over second-wave feminism and gay rights in 1969 to 1973. Some people who have replied to Hare's threads pointed out that, in his analogy, progressive movements are equated with the terror. But that may not be necessarily a bad thing on today's left, where makeshift guillotine have been deployed at protests as a symbol of righteous retribution. There is an ongoing debate about whether the French Revolution was a worthy effort gone terribly wrong, or was irredeemably bad, from the day the Bastille fell in July 1789. Conservatives like Yoram Hazany believe that the revolution's plunge into murderous violence was the inevitable outcome of Enlightenment ideals of abstract universal rights. Others, such as historian David Andrus, argue that the descent into terror was caused by historical factors that derailed the transition to liberal governance. Among these factors, an economic crisis that caused widespread privation, poor leadership, including a king whose indecision and ineptitude doomed the attempt to craft a constitutional monarchy, religious conflicts over the institutional power of the Catholic Church and its connection to the Vatican, and the external threat, given that France was at war with Austria and Prussia when the terror began, and later also with Spain and England. While I lean towards the liberal view, there is little doubt that revolutionary extremism was fueled in part by radical versions of Enlightenment idealism, particularly Jean-Jacques Rousseau's egalitarian and collectivist republican vision. It also seems clear that the failure of the revolution's moderate leaders to take a firm stand against mob violence early on helped to pave the road to hell. What's beyond dispute is that the revolution ended up on that road, especially after the fall of the monarchy in August 1792. The point of no return may have been passed in early September, amid fears that invading Prussian troops could reach the capital. Parisian mobs, aided by officials of the new radical city government, went on a 3-day killing spree in the city's prisons. Some 1,500 inmates were slaughtered. They were suspected of counter-revolutionary plotting and viewed as a potential fifth column. In France's new legislative body, the National Convention, a power struggle between the radicals led by Maximilien Robespierre and the moderates, led by a group of deputies from the Gironde region, the Girondins, continued for a few more months. On the 31st of May, 1793, cannon-wielding insurrectionists, backed by the city government and aided by troops from the Parisian National Guard, which had been placed under the command of Jacobin agitator François Henriot, surrounded the Tuileries, then the seat of the convention, and demanded the expulsion and arrest of 22 Girondin deputies. At the end of the standoff, 29 deputies were expelled from the convention and placed under house arrest. Nearly all were eventually executed, except for a few who managed to escape and hide in the countryside until the terror was over. The official start of the Terror has often been set as the 5th of September 1793, when the convention is sometimes said to have decreed that terror is the order of the day. Not quite. What happened on that day was that a rowdy, menacing crowd of militants entered the convention with a petition demanding that terror be placed on the order of the day. That is, on the day's agenda, and one of the deputies who spoke in response, Bertrand Barrère, promised to do that. By then, the regime had already grown overtly authoritarian. 2 days earlier, the entire company of the Théâtre de la Nation, formerly the Comédie Française, had been imprisoned because a line in a new play denouncing religious persecution and praising tolerance was perceived as a veiled swipe at political persecution, both by the audience, which burst into vigorous applause, and by a Jacobin commissar in attendance who took offence. One story, possibly apocryphal, claims that the actors owed their survival to a former colleague, now a clerk in the Republic's bureaucracy of repression, who quietly disappeared their case files. On the 17th of September, the convention passed a law on suspects that made broadly defined categories of people subject to arbitrary detention. Among these were those who by their conduct, associations, comments, or writings have shown themselves partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty, those who couldn't properly account for their means of existence and the performance of their civic duties, those who had been denied a certificate of good citizenship by their local revolutionary authority, and former nobles, especially ones related to émigrés, who had not constantly demonstrated their devotion to the revolution, and so on. Over the next 10 months and 22 days, between 300,000 and 400,000 men and women, as many as 1.5% of France's adult population, were arrested under this law. Nearly 17,000 were tried, sentenced to death and guillotined. Historian Donald M. Greer's 1935 volume, The Incidents of the Terror During the French Revolution, A Statistical Interpretation, remains the definitive study of the subject. It cites the precise number of 16,594 across the country, and 2,639 in Paris. Some 10,000 died in overcrowded, unsanitary prisons. Ironically, despite all the egalitarian rhetoric, prisoners with money were generally able to secure decent quarters and even get gourmet meals delivered from outside. Greer notes that in some regions more people died in prisons than by the guillotine. An estimated 20,000 more were killed, often extrajudicially, by firing squads and other means, such as the infamous noyades or mass drownings, carried out in Nantes by Representative on Mission Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Between 1,800 and 4,000 prisoners, including priests, nuns, and suspected royalist sympathizers, were stripped naked, bound, and loaded onto flat-bottomed barges that were sunk in the River Loire. It's unclear whether these numbers are part of the overall death toll for the Vendée region in the south of France, where peasants and nobles had risen up against the revolutionary government. It is now believed that some 200,000 people died in exceptionally brutal reprisals that some call a genocide, though it's difficult to tell how many victims were non-combatants and how many perished from war-related hunger and disease. In Paris, the machinery of the Terror, which involved both the Revolutionary Tribunal and two powerful committees set up by the Convention, the Committee of General Security and the Committee of Public Safety, slowly creaked into action after September 1793. At first there were relatively few executions. They mostly involved such notorious Ancien Regime figures as the former Queen, Marie Antoinette, and the former Royal Mistress, Jeanne du Barry, as well as the Jacobin regime's political opponents, above all the former Girondin deputies, and their allies such as writer and salon hostess Marie-Charles Roland, known as Manon. When 21 former Girondin deputies were brought before the tribunal, they did a too effective job of parrying the flimsy charges of counter-revolutionary conspiracy. The trial dragged on for 6 days. Then a rapidly passed decree allowed the jurors, who were paid and ideologically vetted employees of the tribunal, to vote on a verdict as soon as they felt sufficiently enlightened. They promptly sentenced all 21 deputies to death. Other prominent casualties had run afoul of the regime in other ways. Among these victims were liberal nobles who had embraced the revolution. The former Duke Philippe d'Orléans, who had changed his name to Philippe Escalating, had got elected to the convention and had even voted to condemn his cousin King Louis XVI to death. Now he was a marked man, simply because he belonged to a branch of the royal family. The former Duke Armand Louis Logeon, known as Biron, who had fought in the American Revolutionary War and had led the French Republic's troops to victories in Italy, was accused of insufficient zeal against the Vendée rebels. He resigned his post, but was soon arrested. He went to the guillotine on the last day of 1793. The killing machine was picking up speed. Many of the victims were priests and nuns who had rejected the revolution's reforms that brought the church in France under state control. Some had been office holders under the Ancien regime. Some were accused of being political émigrés because they had lived abroad at some point after July 1789 and couldn't account for those travels to the tribunal's satisfaction. Some had been reported to the Surveillance Committees for seditious words. A labourer griping about low pay and complaining that he had been better off under the monarchy. A housemaid expressing sympathy for the woes of Marie Antoinette. Some were falsely accused by people with grudges against them. Snitching proliferated, as it would some 140 years later under Stalin's Great Terror in the Soviet Union. The nobility, and especially the clergy, were disproportionately targeted. Nobles made up only about 2% of the French population under the Ancien regime, but accounted for over 8% of terror victims. The clergy made up less than 1% of the population, but 6% of those executed. Even so, 85% of the victims were commoners, from wealthy businessmen to shopkeepers, artisans and labourers, whose interests the Jacobins claimed to represent. In early 1794, fissures appeared among the Jacobins. A far-left faction, the Enraged, led by gutter journalist Jacques-René Hébert, pushed for more executions and more redistribution of property. The Indulgents, led by famous revolutionary orator Georges Danton and journalist Camille Desmoulins, began to criticize the mass detentions and executions, as well as the attacks on Christianity. The Hébertists were crushed at the end of March. The Dantonists followed them to the guillotine in mid-April after another sham trial. As spring turned into the hot summer of 1794, or year 2 of the Republic, the terror went into overdrive. The law of 22 Prairial, the 10th of June, removed from the Revolutionary Tribunal the last vestiges of due process. It dispensed with witnesses, except when deemed necessary by the prosecutor, and with defence counsel, tersely stating that wrongly accused patriots would have patriotic jurors as their defenders, while enemies of the people deserved no defence. Non-capital penalties were eliminated, leaving acquittal or death as the only 2 options. The list of capital offences now included spreading false news to divide or trouble the people, corrupting the public conscience, diluting the energy and purity of revolutionary and republican principles, etc. What's more, the law not only empowered all citizens to seize and bring in counter-revolutionaries and conspirators, but actively required them to report such individuals to the authorities. By the time Robespierre and his allies rammed this law through the cowed convention, executions were already increasing steadily. In Paris they more than doubled between Germinal, that is late March to late April, and the following month, Floréal, though this was due partly to the decision to shut down most provincial tribunals and consolidate nearly all cases in the capital. The Prairial law unleashed La Grande Terreur, France's own Great Terror. The monthly count of executions went from 334 in Floréal to 509 in Prairial, 796 in Messidor, and 342 in just the first 9 days of Thermidor. More significant was the conviction to acquittal ratio. In the tribunal's early days, a defendant had roughly a 50-50 chance of being acquitted. By Germinal Year 2, the acquittal rate was around 30%. It fell to 25% in Prairial, just under 21% in Messidor, and below 20% from 1 to 9 Thermidor. If the terror's final day indicated a trend, things were going in an even more nightmarish direction. On 9 Thermidor there were 44 death sentences, and 2 acquittals, an acquittal rate of about 5%. The cases at the Revolutionary Tribunal also grew more grotesque. They frequently involved imaginary prison conspiracies. Detainees who barely knew each other were tried and executed in batches of 20 or 30. By many accounts, the Paris population was increasingly put off by the daily butchery, even before the Prairial law. In May, perhaps sensing this distaste, the authorities had the guillotine moved from the Place de la Révolution, in the heart of Paris, now the Place de la Concorde, to a more remote location. The 17th of June execution of 54 people, accused of a bogus conspiracy to assassinate Robespierre, was particularly badly received. The group included an 18-year-old housemaid, so small and thin that some thought she was 12 or 13, and a distraught mother, Jeanne de Saint-Amaron, going to her death with her 19-year-old daughter and her 16-year-old son. Meanwhile, the convention was also getting restive, amid heavy hints that the triumvirate of Robespierre, Louis-Antoine Saint-Just, and Georges Couthon was preparing a new purge. The Prairial law had stealthily removed the presumptive immunity accorded to deputies, whose arrest had previously required a vote by the convention. 2 people in particular feared for their lives. Jean-Lambert Tallien, who had been the convention's envoy and enforcer, representative on mission, in Bordeaux, and had been swayed towards leniency by his aristocratic lover, Thérèse Carabus, and possibly also by payoffs from wealthy suspects, had been recalled to Paris due to perceived moderationism. Thérèse, meanwhile, was in prison and could have been hauled before the tribunal at any time. Joseph Fouché, formerly the representative on mission in Lyon, was, by contrast, accused of revolutionary excess. Not only had he orchestrated gruesome mass executions, in which suspected rebels were bound with ropes and blown up using grape shot from cannon, which was a bit much even for the Jacobins of Paris, he had also aroused Robespierre's ire by preaching atheism. Each man, Tallien and Fouché, separately worked frantically behind the scenes to convince fellow deputies that it was either Robespierre's head or theirs. On 8 Thermidor, Robespierre gave a speech that threatened new purges against unnamed traitors and conspirators. He probably thought that this would cow his potential opponents. He never considered that it might drive them to desperation instead. The man obsessed with fictional plots missed the real one under his nose. At the 9 Thermidor session of the convention, Tallien sprang into action, interrupted what was to be a big speech from Saint-Just, with the help of presiding deputy Collot d'Herbois, who was in on the plot, and seized the floor to denounce those who wanted to divide and rule the convention. At one point he whipped out a dagger and threatened to kill Robespierre himself, Brutus-like, if the convention did not stop the tyrant. The French revolutionaries were addicted to dramatic gestures. Tallien's fellow conspirators spoke up too, and the convention's long-intimidated moderate majority was finally emboldened to join in mutiny. Robespierre made frantic attempts to defend himself. D'Herbois wouldn't give him the floor, and other deputies physically blocked his path to the rostrum and shouted him down when he tried to speak. When his voice faltered, someone taunted, "You're choking on Danton's blood." Robespierre's fate may have been sealed when one deputy made sarcastic comments about his habit of posturing as a persecuted victim, and people laughed. Shortly afterwards, the convention voted to arrest Robespierre, Saint-Just, and several other Jacobin leaders. It wasn't quite over. The pro-Jacobin municipal government promptly freed Robespierre and his allies. They took their last stand in the city hall, the Hôtel de Ville, hoping to raise another insurrection against the convention. This time it didn't work. After a dramatic day, chronicled in hour-by-hour detail by British historian Colin Jones in his magisterial 2022 volume, The Fall of Robespierre, troops loyal to the convention stormed the Hôtel de Ville at around 2 a.m. on 10 Thermidor, the 28th of July. Robespierre took a bullet to the face, either a botched suicide attempt or a gendarme shot, and spent the short remainder of his life in agony. His shattered jaw was cleaned and bandaged by a surgeon to keep him alive for the guillotine. Later that day, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and 20 of their associates were tried by the same revolutionary tribunal that had sent thousands of terror victims to their deaths, and the same chief prosecutor, Quillette, perhaps modern history's first example of the murderous bureaucrat in all his banality of evil. The day before, on 9 Thermidor, as yet unaware of the developments at the convention, he had told the executioner Charles Sanson to proceed with the day's executions despite signs of unrest around the city, then gone to dinner with friends where he bitterly lamented the pressures of his job and his exceptionally heavy workload. Since Robespierre and the others had been outlawed by the convention, they were sentenced to death without trial, upon simple confirmation of their identity. The guillotine was moved back to the Place de la Révolution for the occasion. The square and the streets where the tumbrils passed were filled with jubilant crowds. Despite the jubilation, it was far from a given at that point that the terror was over. The victors of Thermidor had no intention of rolling back the revolution. Indeed, they portrayed Robespierre himself as a traitor to the revolutionary cause, even making the preposterous claim that he had planned to crown himself king and marry the surviving teenage daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And many had no intention of going easy on the revolution's perceived enemies either. One key player in the anti-Robespierre revolt, Jacques-Nicolas Billot-Varenne, was later deported to French Guiana and then moved to Haiti. He remained a committed terrorist until his death in 1819. Late in life he opined that the revolution's biggest mistake was not killing all the members of the royal family. While the executions stopped, few prisoners were released at first, but the backlash against the Jacobin regime was picking up momentum. The turning point was probably Talleyrand's speech in the convention on the 28th of August, denouncing the terror. While the opportunistic Talleyrand was hardly a deep thinker, that speech not only introduced the modern concepts of terrorism and terrorist, but offered a compelling analysis of the Reign of Terror. As historian Ronan Steinberg sums up in his 2019 book, The Afterlives of the Terror. The terror, according to Talleyrand, was a political system based on the principle of fear. The art of terror, he said, consists in setting up a trap for every step, a spy in every home, a traitor in every family. The regime must know how to use the public death of a few to terrify the many. The goal was not to eliminate the enemies of the revolution, but to break their will to resist. To be effective, the terror had to be unpredictable and self-expanding. One achieves nothing by having cut off 20 heads yesterday if one is not prepared to cut off 30 heads today, 60 tomorrow. This method of governing, according to Talleyrand, split society in two, those who are afraid and those who make others afraid. So unique was this system of power that Talleyrand used a new word, terrorisme, to describe it. France's new leadership thus explicitly repudiated the Jacobin regime and the terror, though emphatically not the revolution. Political suspects were released. The Jacobin Club was shut down. In March 1795, the surviving Girondins were readmitted to the convention. Some prominent terrorists, including Carrier, the organizer of the mass drownings at Nantes, and Fouquier-Tinville, the prosecutor who claimed that he was just following orders, were themselves sent to the guillotine. Fouché, an extraordinarily shrewd survivor, later to become Napoleon's dreaded Minister of Police, survived by lying low. Left-leaning historians, even those who deplore the terror, have seen Thermidor as the quintessential reactionary triumph. Yet contemporary liberals, such as the poet and convention member Marie-Joseph Chénier, whose Song of Departure rivaled the Marseillaise as the Republic's anthem in 1794, saw it as a new victory for liberty. Chénier's hymn of 9 Thermidor, written for the event's first anniversary, opened with these verses. 9 Thermidor, hail day of liberation! A blood-stained land you come to cleanse and free. A second time you shine upon our nation, the glorious sun of liberty. 2 days redeemed our fathers' ancient shame, and yet the monarch's fallen sceptre passed to tyrants acting in the people's name, until you shattered it at last. This is the author Cathy Young's translation. The 2 days mentioned are the taking of the Bastille in 89 and the fall of the monarchy in 1792. Of course, Chénier's optimistic vision is easy to mock in retrospect, given that post-Thermidor governance was disastrously bad, and Napoleon Bonaparte, succession as first consul and then emperor, was just around the corner. While the Thermidorians made a genuine attempt to craft a system of checks and balances, including a bicameral legislature and a 5-person executive body, the Directoire or Directorate, this in practice was a corruption-riddled mess. Periodic repressions lurched from left to right, sometimes targeting Jacobins or proto-socialist militants, sometimes resurgent monarchists and conservative Catholics. The wars continued. The economy was a shambles, with the nouveau riche elite flaunting its spectacular wealth amid worsening poverty. No wonder this system was so easily toppled by a popular general. But this fiasco does not change the fact that, as historian David Bell puts it, something horrific took place in France in the year before 9 Thermidor, and came to an end as a result of it. Not everyone agrees. In the first half of the 20th century, Robespierre and the Jacobins found their defenders in Marxist historians such as Albert Mathieu, while liberal anti-terror historiography, exemplified by French historian François Furet and British historian Simon Schama, prevailed towards the end of the last century. The 21st century saw a new resurgence of left-wing terror apologetics. In 2003, French historian Sophie Wachnisch, director of research at the French National Centre for Scientific Research, penned a book called In Defence of the Terror, Liberty or Death in the French Revolution. An English-language edition with a rapturous foreword by far-left intellectual Slavoj Žižek came out in 2012. Wachnisch, a radical leftist who later participated in a summer university organized by Révolution Permanente, a self-styled revolutionary communist movement, argued that state-sponsored terror was actually the more humane alternative to legitimate popular violence in defense of the imperiled revolution, such as the September massacres. That argument, that swift and ruthless justice meted out by the revolutionary state would remove incentives for mob vigilantism, was Danton's rationale for creating the Revolutionary Tribunal, an act he later came to regret. More chillingly, Wachnisch also defended the terror as a quasi-religious human sacrifice on the altar of liberté and égalité, a sacred transaction in which the foundation of values required the death of men. Yet her account of this transaction is curiously abstract. She avoids describing any actual deaths, perhaps because to do so would show how repugnant this reasoning is. True, French revolutionary terror never descended into the kind of sadistic brutality that was a regular feature of the Soviet terror, except perhaps in the Vendée. Torture, for instance, was an absolute taboo, perhaps because it was too closely associated with the abhorred practices of the Ancien regime. But the terror regime of 1793 to 94 had its own peculiar cruelties, such as routinely denying the condemned the tiny mercy of last goodbyes. In his trenchant critique of the terror, written shortly before his own execution, Camille Desmoulins was particularly outraged by the treatment of the mother of Antoine Barnave, one of the Revolution's early moderate leaders. I do not believe that liberty would condemn Barnave's mother to knock on the door of the conciergerie for 8 days, hoping to speak to her son, and finally compel this unhappy woman, after she had travelled 100 leagues at her advanced age, to stand on the road to the scaffold to see him one last time. Later on, as it advanced to industrial-scale murder, the Revolutionary Tribunal started sentencing entire families at once, as in the above-mentioned case of Jeanne de Saint-Amand and her children. Guillaume de Malesherbes, the liberal jurist and would-be Ancien Regime reformer, who had defended Louis XVI at his trial, was guillotined in April 1794, together with his daughter, granddaughter, and grandson-in-law. Adrienne de Lafayette, wife of the famous hero of the American and French revolutions, lost her mother, sister, and grandmother in the same mass execution just 5 days before 9 Thermidor. The likely reason she did not join them was that the United States government showed an interest in her fate and the Jacobins were reluctant to alienate the Americans. Lafayette himself survived because he had defected in 1792 and ended up in Austrian captivity. Marie-Joseph Chénier's Hymn of 9 Thermidor contains a poignant passage commemorating the Terror's human cost. And you, whom friendship mourns with tears untold, brave, brilliant, fair, father, son, husband, wife, to comfort loved ones grieving in this world, you never will come back to life. Ah, the sweet memory of the ones who perished. Sometimes, at least, our sorrows will relieve. At least the country, at the tombs we cherish. With us will weep, with us will grieve. That human cost was very personal for Chénier himself. His brother André, later recognized as the greatest French poet of his generation, had died on the guillotine 2 days before the Terror ended. He was one of a number of remarkable men and women who lost their lives in the Terror. The chemist, Antoine Lavoisier, the mathematician and philosopher Nicolas de Condorcet, who either died of illness or committed suicide by poison in his prison cell, the journalist Jacques-Pierre Brissot, who founded continental Europe's first anti-slavery society, Les Amis des Noirs, the Friends of the Blacks, and the pioneering feminist Olympe de Gouache. Meanwhile, the imprisoned suspects, whose lives were almost certainly saved by 9 Thermidor, included British-American political philosopher and pamphleteer Thomas Paine, the brilliant artist Hubert Robert, who left over 100 drawings chronicling prison life under the Terror, the writer Chaudelot de Laclos, author of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, the famous novel of sex and corruption under the Ancien Régime, the biracial composer and violin virtuoso Joseph Boulogne de Saint-Just, who had led a regiment of black and mixed-raced soldiers in the Revolutionary Army, and Rouget de Lille, author of the Marseillaise. While outright defences of the Terror are rare, the view that it saved the fledgling republic from death by foreign invasion and internal rebellion is common among left-wing historians, even ones who, like David Andress, the author of The Terror, the merciless war for freedom in revolutionary France, in which he finds the mass murder abhorrent. But this view is at the very least debatable. The internal rebellions themselves were partly driven by the new regime's increasingly repressive character, even before September 1793. True, France, under the Terror, had military successes in its war against the armies of monarchist Europe, and repressions undoubtedly helped quell resistance to mass conscription. But no one knows how the French army would have fared without the Terror, which imprisoned numerous officers and commanders on paranoid suspicions of treason and conspiracy, and sent many of them to the guillotine. Even François Christophe de Kellermann, the general whose historic victory at Valmy in September 1792 turned the war around after devastating French defeats, survived thanks only to Thermidor. What's more, whatever the Terror may have saved, it certainly wasn't liberty. The war for freedom trampled every one of the liberties proclaimed in the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, from freedom of the press to freedom of worship to due process and the presumption of innocence. The principle of equality gave way to that of collective guilt, with the nobility increasingly demonized as almost innately evil and former nobles relegated to pariah status. The rhetoric of liberty became a front for a ruthless surveillance state of unprecedented reach. Outside France, the effect was to persuade many people who had initially cheered the revolution that human rights and democracy were dangerous ideas, likely to degenerate into chaos and mass murder. In his 2015 book, Phantom Terror, Political Paranoia and the Creation of the Modern State, 1789 to 1848, historian Adam Zamoyski argues that the fear generated by French revolutionary terror significantly slowed down the development of liberalism in Europe in the 19th century. Meanwhile, the notion that the Terror was a defensive measure is simply not borne out by the facts. In 1794, when external and internal threats to the Republic had been almost entirely neutralized, the killing did not abate, but escalated. Regardless of how the Jacobin terrorists may have seen it at the outset, the Terror acquired a demented logic of its own. It came to be, writes Swiss historian Siegfried Weislein, part of a vision for a new society and a new man, a vision of virtue, which was to be achieved by terror. That formula is derived from a lengthy speech Robespierre delivered at the convention in February 1794 on the principles of political morality, as a rebuke to those who wanted to ease repressions. The goal of the Republic, he declared, was to fulfill the human potential tyranny had warped. Selfishness, frivolity, greed, sensuality, vanity, and shallow social graces would give way to magnanimity, wisdom, reason, probity, and love of goodness and glory, ushering in the dawn of the bright day of universal happiness. Foreshadowing the totalitarian paradoxes of George Orwell's 1984, Robespierre argued that this goal was to be achieved by the despotism of liberty against tyranny, and that clemency meant cruelty to the oppressed. If the spring of popular government in the time of peace is virtue, the springs of popular government in revolution are at once virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is destructive, and terror, without which virtue is impotent. Terror is nothing other than prompt, severe, and inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. Among other things, this language convincingly refutes the idea, recently advanced by some French scholars, that the terror as a system built on violence was a concept invented ex post facto by the Thermidorians to justify their anti-Robespierre coup. Robespierre's closest ally, Saint-Just, amplified this rhetoric of homicidal idealism in his own speeches. There is no prosperity to hope for as long as the last enemy of liberty breathes. You have to punish not only the traitors, but even those who are indifferent. You have to punish whoever is passive in the Republic and who does nothing for it. And what constitutes a republic is the total destruction of everything that stands opposed to it. In his 1952 book, The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy, Israeli historian Jacob Talman describes Jacobinism as a proto-totalitarian improvisation. The label fits. The moderate revolutionary thinker Emmanuel Seyer may have uncannily presaged the 20th century concept of totalitarianism when he argued, in an unpublished essay written a year before the terror, that a republic which demanded total devotion from its members was not a république, common cause, but a ré total. The Bolsheviks who built the Soviet Union were right to see the Jacobins as their forerunners. From that perspective, Thermidor can be seen not as a reactionary response to progressive gains, but as a victory over a tyranny claiming to act in the name of progressive ideals. This doesn't mean that the story of Thermidor is black and white. Robespierre himself is a far more complex figure than the vampire monster of Thermidorian legend. The Thermidorians were hardly good guys, and most of them were themselves deeply implicated in atrocities for which the dead Robespierre made a perfect scapegoat. But as David Bell has written, it does not always take righteous people to accomplish a righteous end. On 9 Thermidor, the right side won, and an anti-human regime fell. And if the modern-day pushback against left illiberalism is a Thermidor, that should be viewed as an honour by association. The following article is Remembering 9 Thermidor, The End of the Terror, published in Quillette.com on the 2nd of August, 2024. Written by Kathy Young. Read by William Lang. Thank you for listening.